He said it across the dinner table, like he was canceling a business arrangement. I no longer want you as my wife. 8 years, 2 miscarriages, 1,000 nights of silence she filled with grace and loyalty and quiet devotion, and he ended it in one sentence before his wineglass had even cooled. Victoria Harrington did not cry. She did not raise her voice. She placed her hands flat on the table, looked her husband directly in the eyes, and said something that would hollow him out for the rest of his life. I understand. That is your decision, and I will respect it. And that calm, that devastating, unshakable calm, was the moment Duke Nathaniel Blackwood lost everything he didn't know he had. If this is the kind of story that speaks to your soul, please subscribe to this channel and follow Victoria's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. The dinner had been quiet for most of the evening, not the comfortable quiet of two people who had grown so familiar with each other that words were no longer necessary. This was the other kind, the kind that sat between them like a third person at the table, heavy and deliberate, aware of itself. Victoria had noticed it the moment she took her seat. Nathaniel had not looked at her when she entered the room. He had not asked about her afternoon. He had barely touched the soup that his kitchen staff had spent 2 hours preparing. She told herself it was the weight of his work, the pressure of the season, the latest dispute over land rights with the neighboring estate. She told herself a great many things. It was a habit she had developed over 8 years of marriage, the habit of creating explanations for his distance so that she would not have to sit with what she increasingly feared was the truth. Victoria. His voice was controlled. It was always controlled. Nathaniel Blackwood had never once raised his voice in their home, and in the early years she had mistaken that for steadiness. Yes, she answered. He set down his fork, placed both hands on the table in a posture that she recognized as the one he used before difficult announcements. She had seen it at board meetings. She had seen it when he told his mother that certain investments had failed. She had never expected to see it aimed at her. I have been thinking about this for some time, he said. I want to handle this with dignity and with fairness. I want there to be no misunderstanding between us. She was already very still. I no longer want you as my wife. The candles between them burned without a flicker. Victoria felt the words land, felt the specific weight of each one, and she did something that even she could not entirely explain in the moment. She breathed. Deliberately. The way she had taught herself to breathe in every crisis this household had ever faced. The way she had breathed through grief and through loneliness, and through disappointments she had never spoken aloud. She placed her hands flat on the table. She looked at him. I understand, she said. That is your decision, and I will respect it. Nathaniel stared at her. In his careful preparation for this conversation, and he had prepared, she could see that he had prepared. He had scripted responses to anger. He had scripted responses to tears. He had a version of this conversation ready for accusations, for threats, for the kind of desperate bargaining he had witnessed in similar situations among his peers. He had not prepared for this. Victoria, you have made your position clear, she said. There is nothing more that needs to be said tonight. She stood from the table. She picked up her napkin, folded it once, set it beside her plate with the same precision she brought to every single thing she did in this house, and she walked out of the dining room without looking back. Nathaniel sat alone at the table for a very long time. He had expected relief. That was the part he could not escape in the hours that followed. He had spent months, and if he was honest, longer than that, rehearsing this decision. Constructing the reasoning for it. Building the case in his mind, the way a barrister builds a case before presenting it to a court. He had told himself that their marriage had run its natural course, that they had grown in separate directions, that it was better to end something honestly than to allow it to continue in silence. And somewhere underneath all of that reasonable, carefully structured logic, he had believed that once the words were spoken, he would feel lighter. He did not feel lighter. He felt as though he had walked into a room he had always taken for granted and discovered upon entering it this time that everything he had assumed was permanent had already quietly begun to leave. He poured himself a glass of brandy he did not finish. He reviewed the papers on his desk without reading a single word. And around midnight, he stood outside the door of his wife's chamber and listened to the complete absence of any sound at all. No weeping, no movement, no evidence of distress, just silence. The same silence that had always lived in this house, except that tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt chosen. The following morning, Victoria came to breakfast. She was dressed well. She was always dressed well, and she brought with her the same composure that had defined her every public appearance for the entirety of their marriage. She poured her tea. She asked the household staff about the day's schedule with the same quiet authority she had always used. Nathaniel watched her across the table and waited. "I will need 1 week," she said to him when the staff had withdrawn, not looking up from her cup, "to arrange my affairs and my departure. I hope that is acceptable." "1 week is—" He stopped. "Victoria, I think we should discuss." "I don't believe there is anything further to discuss," she said pleasantly. "You were very clear last evening, and I have no intention of making this more difficult than it needs to be." "I didn't say there were no arrangements to make. I meant, the estate accounts are in order. I will leave detailed notes for whoever takes over their management. The correspondence with the Ashford family regarding the autumn gathering should be sent no later than the 15th. I will draft it before I leave, so there is no disruption. The household staff has their quarterly wages recorded in the blue ledger on the second shelf of your study. I have already spoken with Mrs. Hadley about the linen inventory." Nathaniel stared at her. "I only ask," she continued, finally looking up at him, "that you handle the legal matters with discretion, not for my sake, for the staff. They have served this household faithfully, and they do not deserve the disruption of public gossip about their employer's private affairs. Victoria, that is all I ask." She set down her cup. "I think that is reasonable." She returned her attention to her breakfast. Nathaniel did not eat anything. It was the word reasonable that stayed with him, not spoken in bitterness, not as a weapon. The way she said it, it simply meant what it said. He had expected her to fight for her position, her title, her home. He had expected her to remind him of everything she had given to this marriage, and God knew she had given a great deal, and he had prepared himself to receive that accounting with patience and with fairness. But she wasn't fighting. She was already leaving, and he realized, sitting at that breakfast table, watching his wife plan her own departure with the same organized efficiency she had always brought to managing his household, that something had shifted in him overnight that he was not yet equipped to name. By the second day, the house had already begun to feel different. Not dramatically. Not in any way that he could point to specifically when his man of business, Gerald Hartfield, arrived that afternoon to review the quarterly accounts. "Where is the folder with the correspondence from the Liverpool merchants?" Gerald asked, looking through the organized files that had always materialized exactly where they were needed. "I'll find it," Nathaniel said. He did not find it. 2 hours later, he discovered it in a drawer he had never opened, filed exactly where it should have been, and realized that he had never needed to find it before, because Victoria had already placed it on his desk before the meeting began. Gerald noticed the silence where the prepared files should have been. He was too professional to comment. But Nathaniel saw the slight pause, the adjusted expectation, the careful recalibration that his man of business performed when the estate's usual efficiency was suddenly absent. It was a small thing, but it was the first small thing. On the third day, he found her in the East Wing study. She was sitting at the writing desk that had always been designated as hers, a concession he had made early in their marriage when she'd asked for a space of her own, a request he had granted without ever wondering why she needed it. The surface was covered in organized stacks of paper, letters, documents, a leather folio he did not recognize. "What is all of this?" he asked from the doorway. Victoria did not startle. She looked up calmly the way she always did. "My personal affairs," she said. "Nothing that belongs to this estate. That folio is mine." Her voice remained even. "I have kept separate records of my own business dealings for several years. This is not your property, Nathaniel." Business dealings. He looked at the stacks of paper again. The organized correspondence. The ledgers written in her precise, careful hand ledgers that were clearly not the household accounts he had grown accustomed to seeing. What business dealings? She studied him for the moment. You never asked, she said. In 8 years, you never once asked what I did with my mornings. You knew I managed the household. You appreciated the results. But you never asked what else I might be doing. He had no answer for that because it was perfectly true. I invested, she said simply. Modestly at first, then less modestly. I made arrangements through my correspondence with several of my family's contacts that were never connected to this household's finances. I was careful about that. Why were you careful about that? She looked at him for a long moment with an expression that he could not quite read. Because I was not certain, she said quietly, that this life would always be available to me. The sentence landed in the room and neither of them spoke for a moment. How long have you been uncertain? He finally asked. She turned back to her papers. That is no longer a relevant question, she said. That evening he reviewed his memory of the previous years with a clarity that felt almost surgical. He thought about the conversations he had steered away from her, the decisions he had made without consulting her, the mornings he had left his study to find his correspondence already, sorted his appointments already, organized his meals, already coordinated, and had walked past the woman responsible for all of it without offering anything more than a brief acknowledgement. I thought about the dinner parties where guests had complimented his household's elegance and efficiency, and he had nodded and accepted those compliments as reflections of his own management, when the truth was that he had never managed any of it. She had. He thought about the specific evening years ago now, when he had sat in his club with 2 friends and been asked how he managed to maintain such a smoothly functioning estate alongside his business and political obligations. Good staff, he had said. His friends had nodded. He had believed it himself. He had genuinely believed it was the staff. On the 4th day, a letter arrived from Lord Ashford confirming attendance at the autumn gathering. Nathaniel realized he did not know when the gathering was scheduled. He did not know how many guests had been invited, what accommodations had been arranged, or what the menu discussions had concluded. He knew these things had been handled. He could not have told anyone how. He went to the kitchen to speak with Mrs. Hadley, the head of household staff, and discovered a woman who answered his questions with a barely concealed expression of discomfort, not because she was hiding anything, but because she had spent 8 years receiving her instructions from Lady Victoria and was now being asked to reconstruct those systems for someone who had never needed to understand them before. Her ladyship kept the planning records in the dining room cabinet, Mrs. Hadley said carefully. The lower left drawer. She said she would leave notes. He found the notes. 3 pages. Her handwriting. Every event, every arrangement, every standing instruction for the household over the next 6 months, documented with a precision and completeness that told him she had been preparing this for longer than 1 week. He stood in the dining room reading her handwriting and felt something in his chest that he was not prepared to identify. On the 5th day, he came to find her. She was in the garden, not the formal garden, but the kitchen garden at the back of the estate that she had redesigned 4 years ago, insisting that growing things had a practical value alongside their beauty. He had considered the project minor at the time. He had forgotten about it almost immediately. I read the notes you left, he said. Good, she said, not looking up from what she was doing. It should make the transition manageable. Victoria. He paused. How long? She looked up. How long have you been planning to leave? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. I wasn't planning to leave, she said. I was preparing to survive if I was left. The distinction landed on him like something physical. I thought you were content, he said. I know you did, she replied. And the gentleness in her voice when she said it, not cruelty, not satisfaction, just a quiet certain acknowledgement, was somehow worse than anger would have been. I was your wife for 8 years, she continued. I was faithful to you. I was devoted to this household. I was careful with your reputation and your business and your relationships. I was good at all of it. She paused. And you never once looked at me and thought to ask if I was happy. He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. Not dramatically, just a pause. I am not saying this to wound you, she said. I am saying it because it is true, and because I think you deserve the truth before I leave. You are not a cruel man, Nathaniel. You are simply a man who looked at something that worked and never considered that it worked because someone was working. He stood in the kitchen garden and could not think of a single sentence that was adequate. Was there ever anything? He finally managed. Was there anything I did that you valued? She considered this. Yes, she said. In the second year when my mother was ill, you arranged for a physician from London without being asked. You never mentioned it again. You never used it to claim credit for kindness. She paused. I thought of that for a long time. Then why? Because one kind act does not sustain a person through 8 years of invisibility. She looked at him clearly. I did not need grand gestures. I needed to be seen, and I was not. That night, he could not sleep. He lay in the dark and turned over the word she had used, invisible. I thought about how many times he had walked through rooms where she was present and experienced her presence as simply ambient. Part of the household. Like the furniture was present. Like the drapes were present. I thought about the specific evenings he had spent at his club or at his colleagues' tables or absorbed in his study, and had come home to find everything in order, and had felt a satisfaction that he now recognized as the satisfaction of a man who had never been required to maintain anything himself. He thought about the times she had tried to speak, because she had tried. He could see that now with a clarity that was almost painful. The dinners where she had raised a concern about an estate matter, and he had redirected the conversation. The mornings she had placed a letter on his desk with a note suggesting he read it, and he had thanked her and moved on. The opinions she had offered at the beginning of their marriage that he had listened to politely and then ignored, and that over time she had stopped offering. He had not silenced her with anger. He had silenced her with indifference. And indifference, he was beginning to understand, was its own kind of cruelty, the kind that left no visible marks, the kind that a man could live with for years without recognizing it as damage. On the 6th day, a visitor arrived that Nathaniel had not expected. His mother, Duchess, Eleanor Blackwood, traveled from her home in Westshire the moment she heard the news. He didn't know who had told her, but in a world where information moved through social connections, like water through stone, it had apparently moved quickly. Eleanor Blackwood was 72 years old, a woman of fierce intelligence and absolutely no patience for nonsense. She stood in his study and looked at her son with an expression he recognized from his childhood, the one that meant she was choosing her words carefully so that they would do the maximum possible work. Tell me, she said, that you have not actually done this. Mother, tell me, she repeated, that I have misunderstood what has been reported to me. He said nothing. She sat down. Nathaniel. Her voice was quiet. Quieter than he expected. In 47 years of living in this world and watching the men in this family make their choices, I have witnessed a great many things I would not have chosen. But this. I was not happy in this marriage, he said. Were you unhappy? She asked. He opened his mouth and found he could not immediately answer. Were you actively suffering? She pressed. Were you in pain? Were you being mistreated? Were you being diminished? She paused. Or were you simply not paying attention? The question sat in the room. Because I have watched that woman, Eleanor continued. Manage your household, protect your reputation, navigate your social obligations, and do all of it with a grace and an intelligence that you have treated as scenery. And now you have dismissed her. And I want to understand what exactly is it that you imagined you were freeing yourself from? Nathaniel had no answer. That, his mother said quietly, is the problem. She stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she stopped at the door of his study and turned back. She will be fine, you know, Eleanor said. Whatever you think you know about Victoria Harrington, I can tell you with certainty that she will be more than fine. How do you know that? His mother looked at him. Because I have always known what she was, Eleanor said. I saw it the first time she came to this house. I saw her look at this estate and at you, and I saw a woman who was choosing something very deliberately. Not because she had no other options, because she had made a decision. She paused. Women like that do not break. When they leave, they leave. She walked out. Nathaniel stood alone in his study for a long time. On the seventh day, he came to her door in the morning. He raised his hand to knock. He stood there for what must have been several minutes. He did not knock. He was not certain what he would have said. He was not certain what could be said at this point that would be anything other than too late, and some part of him, the part that had always prided itself on never asking for anything, he was not certain he deserved, could not bring himself to ask. By the afternoon, her trunks had been moved to the front hall. By evening, the carriage was ready. He stood at the window of his study and watched her descend the front steps of Ashworth Manor. Watched her speak briefly with Mrs. Hadley, who was quite clearly attempting to maintain her professional composure and not entirely succeeding. Watched her pause once, just once, at the foot of the steps, her hand resting briefly on the stone balustrade. She did not look back at the window. She did not look back at the house. She got into the carriage, and Duke Nathaniel Blackwood stood at his study window and watched the woman he had discarded ride away from his house with her back straight and her composure intact, and felt for the first time in his adult life something he could only describe as the specific grief of a man who finally understood what he had lost precisely one moment too late. The carriage turned at the gate, the road emptied, and the house that had always worked, that had always run, that had always functioned with the seamless, invisible efficiency that he had never once stopped to examine, settled around him into a silence so complete and so deliberate that it felt less like absence and more like an answer. The first letter arrived 11 days after she left. It was not from Victoria. It was from the London firm that handled the estate's legal correspondence, informing Duke Nathaniel Blackwood that Lady Victoria Harrington had retained separate legal counsel, and that all further communication regarding the terms of their separation should be directed accordingly. He read the letter twice. Then he set it on his desk and sat with it for a long time. He had expected her to need him to navigate this, to need his guidance, his connections, his knowledge of how these matters were handled in their world. He had expected, if he was being completely honest with himself, that the practical complexity of separating from a man of his position would slow her down. Give him time. Allow the situation to remain unresolved long enough for something he couldn't have named what to change. Instead, she had arrived in London, secured legal representation, and begun handling her affairs with the same quiet efficiency she had brought to managing his household for 8 years. He had not given her enough credit. That thought arrived slowly, the way uncomfortable truths always do. Not in a single moment of revelation, but in a gradual accumulation of small realizations that built on each other until the weight of them was impossible to ignore. Gerald Hartfield came to the estate that same week. He arrived with his usual organized folio and his usual professional calm, and within 20 minutes of sitting down to review the quarterly accounts, that calm had developed a visible crack. "Where is the notation on the Whitmore lease renewal?" Gerald asked, turning pages that should have contained something and did not. "I haven't gotten to it," Nathaniel said. Gerald looked up. "Her ladyship typically had this section prepared before our meetings." "Her ladyship is no longer here." The silence that followed that sentence was the kind that professionals produce when they are deciding how to respond to information they find alarming. "I see," Gerald said carefully. "Then we should perhaps begin with a general review of the account structure so that I can understand the current." "The account structure is what it has always been." "Yes, of course." Gerald turned another page, paused again. "And the correspondence file for the Alderton matter that was typically cross-referenced with the land survey records from... I don't know where that is." Another pause. Gerald set down his pen. "Your Grace," he said, and his voice had shifted from professional to something more careful. "I want to be of maximum use to you in this transition. But I need to be direct with you. The management systems I have relied on for the past 6 years, the organized correspondence, the cross-referenced accounts, the advanced preparation of meeting materials, those systems appear to have been maintained entirely by her ladyship. And without her here, I am finding that I cannot locate approximately half of what I would normally need to conduct this review." Nathaniel stared at him. "Half," he said. "At minimum," Gerald said. He said it with the measured composure of a man delivering a diagnosis. The room was very quiet. "Tell me what you need," Nathaniel said. "We will find it." They spent 4 hours finding it. 4 hours going through drawers and cabinets and correspondence files that Nathaniel had walked past every day of his working life and never opened. 4 hours discovering systems that Victoria had developed and maintained and refined over years, cross-referencing systems, notation systems, filing systems that made perfect logical sense once you understood them, and that had made his professional life immeasurably easier without him ever once knowing they existed. When Gerald finally left that evening, Nathaniel sat alone in his study, surrounded by the organized chaos of files he had finally located, and felt something that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but lived somewhere between the two. He had told people, himself included, that his estate ran well because he made good decisions and maintained good staff. He had never once considered that his estate ran well because his wife had quietly built an invisible architecture underneath everything, and then stood back and let him believe it ran itself. The second week without her, a letter arrived from Lady Pemberton, declining the invitation to the Ashworth Autumn Gathering. Nathaniel frowned at it. Then he went looking for the original invitation list to understand the scope of the cancellation. He could not find it. He asked Mrs. Hadley. Mrs. Hadley, a woman of 60 years, who had served this household since before Nathaniel's marriage, and who was visibly uncomfortable with the position she now found herself in, said carefully, "Her ladyship maintained the social correspondence in the writing room, Your Grace. I believe she left notes." He had read the notes. They told him what to do. They did not tell him everything Victoria had known about why the specific dynamics of each relationship, the histories between families, the particular sensitivities that required handling with care. Victoria had been managing those relationships for 8 years. She had known things about his social world that had never been written down because they had lived in her memory and her judgment. He sent a response to Lady Pemberton that he thought was appropriate. Lady Pemberton did not write back. He found out 3 weeks later through the social grapevine that his mother navigated with practiced ease that his response had contained an inadvertent slight regarding a family matter that anyone with knowledge of the Pemberton history would have known to avoid. Victoria would have known to avoid it. He had not known it was a thing to avoid. When his mother relayed this information, she did so without editorial comment. She simply told him what had happened and waited. "I didn't know about the Pemberton situation," he said. "No," his mother agreed. "You didn't." "How did Victoria know?" Eleanor looked at him steadily. "Because she paid attention to people, Nathaniel. Because she listened. Because she understood that managing the social relationships of a household of this position requires an ongoing investment of attention and memory, and genuine care for the people involved." A pause. "Did you ever wonder how she always knew what to say to people? What topics to raise, what topics to avoid, what made each person feel genuinely welcomed rather than merely received?" He had wondered this vaguely, in the way a man wonders about a skill he has never been required to develop himself. "She worked at it," Eleanor said simply. "She worked at it every day. And the results of that work appeared effortless to you because she was good enough at it that the seams never showed." He began in the 3rd week to genuinely take stock, not of what he had lost. He was not yet able to fully look at that, but of what had actually been happening in his household during the 8 years of his marriage, because he was only now beginning to understand that he had been living inside a structure he had never examined. He reviewed the household accounts from the beginning of their marriage. The early years were spare, appropriate for the scale of what the estate required, but spare. Careful. And then, around the 3rd year, something had shifted. Spending in certain areas had become more strategic. Small investments in relationships, gifts, sent at exactly the right moment. Contributions to the right charitable causes. Arrangements made for visiting guests that went beyond what was strictly required and transformed a polite obligation into a genuine warmth. The estate's social standing had risen during their marriage. He had believed it rose because of his increasing prominence in business and politics. He had been looking in the wrong direction entirely. He found a notation in the accounts from 2 years into their marriage, a subscription to a business publication, small and unremarkable, listed under household expenses. He had never noticed it. He had certainly never read it. But someone had. He went looking for the issues. He found them in her study, every issue for 6 years, organized and annotated in her handwriting. Notes in the margins. Observations about market trends. Underlined sections relevant to his business dealings, sometimes with a specific name written next to them. A name he would need to know, a development he should be aware of, a risk he hadn't considered. She had been reading business intelligence and tracking his professional landscape for 6 years. She had never been given credit for a single piece of it. He sat in her study with those annotated publications and understood that the quiet woman who had managed his household had also been, in some very real sense, a partner in his professional success. A partner he had never acknowledged, never consulted, and never once thought to recognize. He called on his old friend Thomas Graywell in the 4th week, partly to escape the suffocating awareness of the house, and partly because Thomas was the kind of man who spoke plainly when plainness was required. Thomas received him with the easy warmth of 30 years of friendship. He poured whiskey. He did not ask if Nathaniel wanted. He did not mention Victoria immediately, and Nathaniel understood this as a kindness. Thomas was giving him time to arrive at it himself. They talked about other things for a while. Business, politics, the unseasonable warmth of the autumn. Then Thomas said, "She's already found a house in London." Nathaniel looked at him. "My wife had it from Cecilia Harrington, who apparently received a letter 2 weeks ago," Thomas said. "Victoria has taken a house on Cavendish Street, well situated by all accounts, reasonable in size but in exactly the right location." He paused. "She didn't waste any time." "No," Nathaniel said. "She didn't." Thomas swirled his glass. He was looking at Nathaniel with the kind of careful measuring expression that old friends use when they are deciding how much truth the moment can hold. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said. "I suspect you're going to. Did you actually want to end this marriage? Or did you simply want something to change, and that was the only option you thought you had?" Nathaniel said nothing. "Because," Thomas continued, "I have watched you and Victoria for 8 years, and I want to say something that you are free to disregard entirely, because it is likely too late to matter." He paused. "I have never seen a woman work as hard to be a good wife to a man who was working just as hard not to notice. Thomas, I'm not condemning you. I am telling you what I saw." He set his glass down. "She cared about you, Nathaniel. Not about your title, not about your money. She cared about you. And I watched her try to reach you for years, and watched you remain somewhere slightly out of reach, and I thought many times that I should say something. I chose not to. That is my own failure to account for." Nathaniel stared at the fire. "What do I do with that?" he asked. Thomas looked at him honestly. "I don't know," he said. "I think that depends entirely on what kind of man you decide to be going forward." The news reached him at the beginning of November. It came through his man of business, which meant it was business news, and that alone was enough to stop him cold before he even read the specifics. Victoria had made an investment. Not a modest investment. Not the kind of quiet, careful, modest financial maneuvering he had assumed she meant when she told him she had been investing her personal funds. She had become a principal investor in a shipping concern based out of Liverpool, a company that, according to the intelligence Gerald had gathered, was positioned extremely well for a period of significant expansion. The amount she had committed was substantial, more substantial than he had imagined she possessed. He read the report twice. Then he looked at Gerald and said, "How long has she been accumulating this capital?" Gerald cleared his throat. "Based on what I can piece together from the timeline, Your Grace, it appears she began approximately 4 years into your marriage. Small amounts initially. Then, as the investments returned, income reinvested. The shipping company is not her only holding, it is simply the most recent and the most significant. 4 years. She had been building this for 4 years while managing his household and protecting his reputation and attending his social obligations and presenting a face of perfectly contented domesticity to the world, and no one had known. She never accessed estate funds, Nathaniel asked. Not a penny, Gerald said. He said it with a precision that told Nathaniel he had checked very carefully. Everything she accumulated came from her own personal resources, gifts, an inheritance from an aunt that I was not previously aware of, and the returns on her own investments. She never touched anything that belonged to this estate. Of course she hadn't. She had wanted to be completely free when she left. She had wanted to owe him nothing, not her income, not her security, not a single piece of her future. He understood now why she had been so calm at that dinner table, why she had looked at him with that expression that had haunted him every night since. She had not been calm because she was defeated. She had not accepted his words with quiet dignity because she had no choice. She had been calm because she was ready. She had been ready for years. A letter arrived from his mother in the second week of November. It was brief in Eleanor's characteristically economical style, and it contained one piece of information that she delivered without elaboration or commentary, because she knew, as she always knew, exactly which facts needed no decoration. Victoria had been seen at a lecture at the Royal Society, not as a guest of someone else's invitation, not as an accessory on someone's arm. She had attended as a member of a small group organized by a society for the advancement of women in commerce and public life, a group that, according to Eleanor's source, included some of the most formidable women in London's intellectual circles. She spoke during the discussion period, Eleanor wrote. By all accounts, she was the clearest voice in the room. Nathaniel read that sentence several times. He had attended events with Victoria for 8 years. He had sat beside her at dinners and at gatherings and at the various obligations their social position required. And he had watched her navigate those events with an ease and a grace that he had categorized without ever thinking about it as pleasant social competence. The ability to say the right things to the right people at the right moments. He had never thought of it as intelligence. He had never thought to ask her at the end of a dinner what she actually thought about the things that had been discussed. He had never wondered whether the quiet woman beside him had opinions. She had not voiced ideas. She had not shared arguments. She had not made, because no one at the table had thought to invite them. She had been speaking at lectures while he was sitting alone in his study, telling himself he missed the efficiency of her household management. I was beginning to understand that what he missed was considerably larger than that, and the understanding was not arriving gently. He went to London in December. He told himself it was for business. There were meetings that required his presence, decisions that needed to be made in person, relationships that needed maintaining. None of this was untrue. But as his carriage moved through the streets of the city on the morning of his third day there, and took a route he had not intended to take, and slowed near Cavendish Street, without him having given any instruction to slow, he acknowledged to himself briefly that business was not the only reason he had come. He did not stop. He was not certain what stopping would mean, or what he would do after the stopping, or whether there was anything at all that could be done at this point that would not be in some profound and irreversible way too late. The carriage moved on. That evening, at a dinner hosted by Lord Castlemaine, he walked into a room and found himself on the opposite side of it from his wife, for the first time since she had left. Victoria was standing with a group of 4 people. A woman he did not recognize, whom he would later identify as a Mrs. Georgiana Crane, recently widowed and known for her investments in textile manufacture. And 2 men, one he knew slightly, one he did not know at all, who were both leaning toward Victoria, with the specific attentive posture of people who are listening carefully to what someone is saying. She was speaking, not in the deferential, carefully measured tone she had used in social settings during their marriage. The tone he had always experienced as pleasant and appropriate, and had never once thought to question. She was speaking with the ease of someone who had found the register of her own voice, and was no longer adjusting it for anyone else's comfort. She had not seen him yet. He stood and watched her for a long moment, and in that moment, he experienced something he had not expected and was not prepared for. He was proud of her. It arrived without his permission and settled in his chest with the weight of something true. He was proud of the woman standing across that room, proud of how she held herself, proud of the directness in her expression, proud of the way those people were listening to her, and underneath the pride, sharp and specific and entirely deserved, was the recognition that he had spent 8 years with this woman and never given her a single room in which to be this version of herself. He had not taken her light. She had never let him. But he had certainly never offered her a window. She saw him before he reached her. He watched her notice him across the room, watched the brief moment of adjustment that crossed her face, something that resolved quickly into composure, and he crossed toward her with the awareness that he was doing something he had not planned and could not take back. "Victoria," he said. "Nathaniel." Her voice was even. She did not move toward him or away from him. The people she had been speaking with registered the exchange, and with the social awareness that distinguished London's better-mannered circles, found reasons to direct their attention elsewhere. "You look well," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Thank you." "I heard about the shipping investment," he said. "Gerald brought me the information. I wanted you to know I was not attempting to monitor your activities. It came through routine business channels." "I know," she said. "I had anticipated it might. It's an excellent investment." "I know that too." A beat of silence. "I've been attempting to manage the estate accounts," he said. Something moved in her expression. Not quite amusement, not quite sympathy. Something that contained elements of both. "How is that going?" she asked. "It is going," he said carefully, significantly less smoothly than I had assumed it would. She looked at him for a moment. "Gerald is good," she said. "If you let him help you reorganize the systems, rather than trying to locate what I built, he'll manage. He's capable. I was always glad you had him." The sentence, that small, unremarkable sentence, hit him in a way he had not anticipated, because it was entirely typical of her. Even now. Even here in this room where she owed him nothing, she was offering him something useful. Genuinely useful. With no agenda, no barb, no attempt to make him feel the weight of what he'd lost. She was simply, as she had always simply been, trying to help. "Victoria," he said, and his voice did something he had not intended. "I have been—" She stopped him. Not unkindly, just stopped him. "Not here," she said quietly. "Not tonight." He looked at her. "Not because I don't believe you have something to say," she continued, "but because I have worked very hard for the past several months to build something that belongs entirely to me. And I would like to keep it that way for a little while longer, without disruption." She looked at him directly. "I think you can understand that." He could understand it. I understood it with the specific clarity of a man who finally understands things too completely and too late. "I understand," he said. She nodded. Once. And then the woman he had married, the woman he had dismissed, the woman he had failed to see for 8 solid years, turned back to her evening with the composure of someone who had already made her peace and was simply living. He stood alone on his side of the room, and for the first time in his life, Nathaniel Blackwood understood what it felt like to be the one who was invisible. He returned to Ashworth Manor the following morning and told himself he felt nothing. I was practiced at this. At the careful, deliberate act of setting aside what he felt and replacing it with what was manageable. It was a skill he had developed young in a household where emotion was treated as a kind of indulgence, something that lesser men surrendered to, something that a Blackwood learned to contain. His father had been this way. His grandfather before that. The family produced men who made decisions and moved forward, and did not linger in the uncomfortable territory between what they had done and what they felt about it. Nathaniel had always considered this a strength. Standing alone in his study on a cold December morning, he was beginning to reconsider. The encounter at Castermain's dinner had not left him the way he'd expected. He had expected it to provide some resolution, some clarity about where things stood, some closure that would allow him to move forward with the practical business of reorganizing his life. Instead, it had given him something far less comfortable. It had given him a clear and unobstructed view of exactly who Victoria was when no one was requiring her to be anything other than herself. And that view had not left him. Gerald arrived that week with revised accounts and a carefully worded recommendation that Nathaniel consider bringing in additional clerical support to manage the correspondence load. He made the suggestion, diplomatically framing it as a natural evolution of the estate's needs. But Nathaniel understood what it meant. It meant that one person had been doing the work of 3, and that person was gone, and the gap she had left was not the kind of gap that could be filled by a single replacement, because it was not a single role. It was a dozen roles performed simultaneously, invisibly, and apparently without effort, though he understood now that the appearance of effortlessness had been its own kind of labor. "Find whoever you need," Nathaniel told him. "Get the systems running again." Gerald nodded. "I'll begin with correspondence management and work outward from there." After Gerald left, Nathaniel sat for a long time without doing anything. I thought about what Thomas had said, about the kind of man he was going to decide to be going forward. He had been turning that question over for weeks now, examining it from different angles, and he kept arriving at the same uncomfortable recognition that the man he had been for the past 8 years was a man he did not particularly admire. Not because he had been deliberately unkind, but because indifference at that scale maintained over that length of time was its own kind of failure. The kind that didn't announce itself. The kind that arrived quietly day by day in the accumulated weight of 1,000 moments where he could have chosen differently and hadn't. I didn't know yet what to do with that recognition, but he was no longer willing to look away from it. January arrived with the kind of cold that made Ashworth Manor feel larger than it was. It was a house built for a family, for the noise of children, and the movement of extended household members, and the social traffic of a woman who knew how to fill space with warmth. Without Victoria, without the particular texture of her presence, the house was simply large. The staff moved through it efficiently, doing their jobs with professionalism, but the specific quality that had made it feel inhabited rather than merely occupied, that was gone. He noticed it most in the evenings. During the day, there was enough to occupy his attention: the estate business, the correspondence backlog, the ongoing effort to reconstruct the management systems that had collapsed in Victoria's absence. But in the evenings after dinner, in the hours he had previously spent in his study, while somewhere in the same house, a light burned in the east wing, and a woman he had never appreciated enough sat reading or writing, or doing the quiet, useful work she had always done in those hours, the house felt like a proof of something. I was not entirely sure he wanted to know what it was proving. His cousin Richard Dunmore came to visit in the second week of January. Richard was 2 years older than Nathaniel, a man whose cheerful surface concealed a sharp and observant mind, and he arrived with a bottle of good wine and the stated intention of spending several days in the country away from London's social obligations. They got along well, always had. Richard had the gift of comfortable companionship, the ability to sit in a room with another person without requiring the room to be anything other than what it was. On the second evening, Richard said, "I saw Victoria at a dinner at the Whitfields last month." Nathaniel kept his expression even. "How did she seem?" "Extraordinary," Richard said without hesitation. He said it with the directness of someone reporting a fact. "I want to be careful with how I say this because I don't want it to come out wrong, but she was different. Not a different person. More herself, if that makes sense. Like someone who had been speaking at a volume slightly below what was natural and had finally found their actual register." He paused. "She's formidable, Nathaniel. She always was, I think, but you could see it more clearly now." Nathaniel said nothing. "She's made some friends," Richard continued. "Real ones. Women who seem to actually value her. There's a woman named Georgiana Crane, who she's apparently become quite close with, a widow, very sharp, very well connected. And a few others I didn't recognize who clearly thought very highly of her." He paused again. "She seemed happy." The word landed in the room, not cruelly. Richard had not said it cruelly, but it landed the way truth lands when you have been half hoping that the person you hurt was hurting too, and you discover that they are not, and you understand that this is the better outcome, and still feel the specific sting of it anyway. "Good," Nathaniel said, and he meant it, and it cost him something. Richard looked at him steadily. "How are you?" he asked, not as a pleasantry, as an actual question. Nathaniel started, and then stopped. He was about to say fine. He had been saying fine for months. To Gerald, to Thomas, to his mother, to everyone who had asked with genuine concern, and received the same composed, contained, manageable response. "I'm not entirely sure," he said instead. Richard nodded slowly. "That's probably the most honest thing you've said since this happened." "Probably," Nathaniel agreed. "Can I ask you something and you don't have to answer? You're going to ask anyway." What did you actually want? Richard said. When you ended it, what were you looking for? What were you expecting to find on the other side of that decision? Nathaniel looked at the fire. I don't know, he said. It was the truest answer he had. Because I've been trying to understand it, Richard said, and I can't, not because I'm judging you, but because you had a remarkable woman in your life, and a functioning household, and a social position that was genuinely the envy of most of your peers, and you walked away from it without, as far as I can tell, any clear sense of what you were walking toward. No, Nathaniel said quietly. I didn't have a clear sense. Was there someone else? No. Then what? I don't know, Richard. His voice was quieter now. I think I wanted to feel something. I think I was dissatisfied with something I couldn't name, and I made a decision that was irreversible before I had properly understood what I was deciding. He paused, and by the time I understood it, she was already gone. Richard sat with this for a moment. The thing about Victoria, he finally said, is that she wouldn't have waited forever, even if you hadn't said what you said. You understand that, don't you? She was already moving. You just accelerated the timeline. Nathaniel stared at him. She's been building that life for years, Richard said. Those investments, those connections, she didn't do all of that in the months since she left. She did it while she was still there, which means she was already preparing. He looked at Nathaniel directly. She was loyal to you. I believe that entirely. But she had also already understood something about your marriage that you hadn't caught up to yet. The fire burned. Nathaniel thought about the leather folio on her desk, the annotated business publications, the 4 years of careful, quiet accumulation. She knew, he said, not a question. She knew, Richard said simply. Not that it would end on that specific night, but that it might end, and she decided she was going to be ready. February brought a piece of news that Nathaniel received through his mother, delivered in person over tea at Eleanor's London residence during a brief visit he had made for business. Eleanor poured tea with the precision she brought to everything and then said, Lord Adrian Whitmore has called on Victoria twice in the past month. Nathaniel set down his cup. Lord Adrian Whitmore. He knew the name. Knew it well enough. Whitmore was 41, a widower of 4 years, known in their circles for a temperament that most people described as unusually thoughtful. He had built a significant fortune in land development and had spent the past several years directing a portion of it toward educational initiatives, the kind of philanthropy that reflected genuine conviction rather than social strategy. He was by every account Nathaniel had ever encountered a man of actual character. Define called on, Nathaniel said. Socially, Eleanor said. He attended the same gathering as Victoria at Georgiana Crane's home, and apparently spoke with her at length, and then arranged to be at a second event she attended the following week. She lifted her own cup. He is not subtle, apparently, which is, I suppose, at least honest. Nathaniel was quiet. Are you going to tell me how you feel about this? Eleanor asked. No. Are you at least going to admit that you feel something about it? He looked at his mother across the tea table, this small, formidable woman who had seen through him his entire life. Yes, he said. I feel something about it. Good, she said. That's a start. It doesn't change anything. It might change you, she said, which is the only thing worth changing at this point. He thought about Adrian Whitmore calling on Victoria. He thought about what Richard had said about a man who finally found what he wanted only after it was gone. He thought about Victoria at the Castermain dinner speaking with the full register of her voice, the people around her leaning forward. He thought about Adrian Whitmore being one of those people. And he felt something he had no right to feel, and felt it anyway completely, and without relief. March arrived, and with it a social obligation he could not avoid. The Harrington Spring Gathering was an annual event of some standing. Victoria's family, the Harringtons, hosted it each year at their estate in Surrey, and it was the kind of occasion that crossed the social calendar in ink, not pencil. To attend would mean navigating the first major social encounter with Victoria's family since the separation. To not attend would be a statement of its own kind, one that would be read and interpreted by everyone who noticed the absence. He attended. He arrived to find a room full of people who knew exactly what had happened and were performing the social grace of appearing not to know. Victoria's mother, Lady Margaret Harrington, received him at the door with a courtesy so precisely calibrated that it contained both complete civility and complete condemnation simultaneously. "Your Grace," she said, "we are glad you could come." What she meant and what she said were two entirely different things, and they both knew it. He moved through the room. He spoke to people. He performed the function of attending a social event with the practiced ease of a man who had spent his adult life in these rooms. And then he saw Victoria across the room, and beside her, Lord Adrian Whitmore. They were speaking with two other people. A couple Nathaniel didn't recognize, and Whitmore was listening to something Victoria was saying with the quality of attention that Nathaniel had spent years failing to offer. Not performative attention. Not the polite attention of someone waiting for the other person to finish. Genuine, focused, interested attention. The kind that says what you are saying matters to me, and I want to understand it. Victoria was gesturing slightly with one hand as she made a point, a small gesture he recognized from years of watching her speak, though he had rarely been on the receiving end of her speaking at any length. Her expression was animated. She was arguing something clearly, and Whitmore was not only listening, but responding, leaning in slightly, and then saying something that made her pause, and then laugh. Not a polite social laugh. A real one. Nathaniel turned away. He found a drink he didn't want, and held it without tasting it, and stood near the far side of the room, and tried to locate the name for what was happening in his chest. He found it eventually. It was regret. Full, clear, unambiguous regret, the kind that doesn't offer any productive path forward, that simply sits and tells you the exact shape of what you have lost, and makes no suggestion about what you should do next. Victoria's cousin James Harrington appeared at his shoulder. James was 28 and made no particular effort to conceal his feelings on most subjects. "She's doing well," James said. He was looking in the same direction Nathaniel was looking, which made his meaning perfectly clear. "I can see that," Nathaniel said. "Whitmore's a good man," James said. "Genuinely good. Not performing goodness for an audience. Actually good." He paused. "He notices her. It's the first thing I thought when I saw them together. He notices her." Nathaniel had nothing to say to that. The sentence required no elaboration, and he understood every word of it. "She deserves that," James said. "I know," Nathaniel said. "Do you?" He turned to look at the younger man. James met his gaze without apology. "Because the time for knowing it was 8 years ago, or 7, or 6, or any single year in between when you might have woken up and noticed what was standing right next to you." He paused. "I'm not trying to wound you. She's my cousin. And I watched her for 8 years try to make something work with a man who made her feel like she was part of the furniture. And now she's happy. And the man she's happy with is standing 3 meters away, listening to her, like every word she says is the most interesting thing he's heard all week." His voice was even, not angry. "So yes, she deserves it." Nathaniel looked back across the room. Victoria had not looked in his direction once. He spoke to her only briefly that evening, when the social geography of the gathering made avoidance impossible. They were near the same door at the same moment, and Victoria, with the social grace she had always possessed, paused and acknowledged him without making the moment more than it was. "You came," she said. "I didn't want your mother to feel I was making a statement." Victoria's expression softened slightly, not warmly, but with recognition. "She would have made a statement of her own," she agreed. A small silence. "You seem well," he said. "I am well," she said. And the directness of it, the absence of any qualifier, any performed modesty, told him more than a longer answer would have. "Victoria." He kept his voice low. "I need you to know I'm not going to make this difficult. Whatever you need from the legal process, whatever terms make this easier for you, I will agree to them. I want to be clear about that." She looked at him for a moment. "I know," she said. "I have always known that. You are not a vindictive man, Nathaniel." "I should have been a better one." Something shifted in her expression. Quick, controlled, but real. "Yes," she said quietly. "You should have." She paused. "But you weren't. And I spent a long time being angry about that, And then I spent some time being sad about it, and now I am neither of those things. She looked at him steadily. I am simply on the other side of it. He wanted to ask about Whitmore. He was aware in some separate, more controlled part of himself that asking was not his right. That the life Victoria was living was not his territory. That the questions he wanted to ask had been forfeited along with everything else he had forfeited on the night he'd looked across a dinner table and said the words he could not take back. He did not ask. "I hope you find what you're looking for," she said. "I mean that sincerely." "I know what I lost," he said. Her expression was gentle, not pitying, not satisfied. Genuinely gentle in the way of someone who has moved far enough past a wound that they can look at its source without anger. "Then learn from it," she said. "That's all any of us can do." She moved away. I watched her return to Whitmore's side. Watched Whitmore register her return with the specific attentiveness of a man who had been waiting for her. Watched Victoria settle back into the conversation with the ease of someone who had landed exactly where she was supposed to be. He left the Harrington gathering 40 minutes later. In the carriage on the road back to London, he sat in the dark and understood with the clarity that arrives only when there is nothing left to protect yourself with exactly what had happened. He had had everything. Not everything he'd thought he wanted, but everything worth having. A woman of extraordinary capability and genuine devotion. A household built on invisible grace. A partnership that had been waiting for 8 years for him to recognize it as one, and he had looked at all of it and seen furniture. Now Adrian Whitmore was looking at the same woman and seeing correctly everything that she was. The carriage moved through the dark, and Nathaniel sat with the full weight of that, not looking away from it, not converting it into something more manageable. He let it be exactly what it was, because he had spent 8 years not letting things be what they were, and he was beginning to understand that the cost of that particular habit was higher than he had ever imagined he would have to pay. April arrived with one more piece of information he had not been seeking. Gerald brought it embedded in the routine business review mentioned almost in passing. But Gerald was not a man who mentioned things in passing, and Nathaniel had learned to hear what was underneath the calm professional delivery. The Liverpool shipping company, in which Victoria had invested, was performing significantly beyond initial projections. The expansion into the northern routes had exceeded everyone's estimates. The principals were already discussing a second phase of investment, and Victoria, as one of the original investors, was positioned to benefit substantially. "How substantially?" Nathaniel asked. Gerald told him. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "She made that decision before she left," he said. "She committed that investment before she walked out of this house." "Yes, Your Grace." She had already understood it was going to work. Gerald considered his response. "Her analysis, from what I can piece together, was very sound. She had been tracking the company for 2 years before she invested. She understood the routes, the competition, the management structure. He paused, choosing his words with care. She knew what she was looking at. Of course she had. She had been reading business publications and annotating them for years. She had been tracking markets and monitoring developments and developing an understanding of commerce that she had never been given a single opportunity to apply within the structure of their marriage. She had applied it elsewhere, quietly, carefully, brilliantly. And now it was working. And Nathaniel sat across from his man of business in the house she had managed, surrounded by the systems she had built, and understood something with absolute finality. Victoria Harrington had not left his life as a woman who had lost something. She had left as a woman who had been waiting patiently, competently, without bitterness, for the moment when she would finally be free to become everything she had always been. He had not ended their marriage. He had, without knowing it, simply gotten out of her way. The legal papers arrived on a Tuesday morning in May. Nathaniel was at his desk when Gerald placed them in front of him, a neat, organized folder with Victoria's solicitor's seal on the outside and 8 years of marriage reduced to numbered clauses on the inside. Gerald set them down without comment and withdrew, which was the right thing to do, and Nathaniel sat alone with the folder for a long time before he opened it. He had told her he would agree to whatever terms made this easier. He had meant it. And when he finally read through the document, he found that Victoria had asked for almost nothing. Her personal property, the investments she had built independently, the release of any claim the estate might make on assets she had accumulated through her own financial dealings, a modest annual settlement that her solicitor had clearly tried to argue upward, and that she had apparently insisted on keeping reasonable. She had not asked for the house in London, though she could have argued for it. She had not asked for access to the estate's holdings, though a more aggressive legal strategy might have found grounds. She had not, in any of the document's careful language, attempted to take from him anything that had not been unambiguously hers. He read it twice. Then he picked up his pen and signed it on every page without changing a single word. He sent it back the same afternoon with a letter brief in his own handwriting, not dictated, that said only, "These terms as from here is simple for you." He did not sign it with his title. He signed it Nathaniel. It was a small thing. He was aware it was a small thing. But he wanted the record somewhere to reflect that at the end of this, he had been a man who let her go cleanly. Summer came to Ashworth Manor with the particular quality it always had. The gardens reaching their fullest, the social season demanding its obligations, the estate settling into the slower rhythm of the warmer months. Nathaniel moved through all of it with a competence that had been hard-earned over the past year. The management systems Gerald had rebuilt were functioning. The correspondence was under control. The estate was not failing. It was simply quieter than it had been. He had made changes. Not dramatic ones. He was not a man given to dramatic gestures, but real ones. He had started reading. Not the business publications, though those too, but other things. Books that Victoria had left behind, that he had never opened, books on history, and on philosophy, and on the particular kind of economics that looked at people rather than numbers. He had found in the reading a quality of attention he had not previously given himself permission to develop. He had started listening differently at social gatherings. Not the strategic listening of a man cataloging useful information, but actual listening. Noticing what people were saying, underneath what they were saying. Noticing what they left out. Noticing the specific texture of their concerns. He was not naturally gifted at this the way Victoria had been. But he was trying. Thomas noticed it first. "You're different," Thomas said at dinner in June bluntly, because that was Thomas's way. "Different how?" Nathaniel asked. "Less sealed," Thomas said, searching for the word. "Like a house where someone finally opened the windows." He paused. "Is that insulting? I don't mean it to be." "No," Nathaniel said. "I think it's accurate." "What happened?" Nathaniel considered the question honestly. "I stopped convincing myself that the way I had always been was the way I was supposed to be," he said. "Those are not the same thing. I confused them for a long time." Thomas looked at him for a moment. "She did that," he said, not accusingly, as a statement of fact. "She showed me the gap," Nathaniel said. "She didn't intend to, but she did." Thomas raised his glass. "Then she gave you something even at the end." Nathaniel raised his own. He thought about that, about the specific, uninvited gift of being forced to see yourself clearly. About the fact that Victoria, who had been given so little by him in return, had managed to leave him with something genuinely valuable. He drank. His mother came to Ashworth in July and stayed for 2 weeks. Eleanor Blackwood, at 72, was not a woman who visited without purpose, and she made no particular effort to disguise hers. She watched her son with the calibrated attention she had always brought to watching people, and she said very little about Victoria until the second week, when they were sitting together after dinner, in the way they had always been able to sit together comfortably without the pressure of performance. "She is happy," Eleanor said. It was not a question. "So I understand," he said. "Whitmore is serious about her." Nathaniel kept his expression even. "Is he?" "He has spoken to her family, formally." Eleanor looked at her son directly. "I thought you should hear it from me, rather than from someone who might deliver it less carefully." The words landed in him the way blows land when you have known they were coming and still feel the impact fully when they arrive. Whitmore had spoken to her family, formally, which meant this was not the early tentative courtship of a man who had noticed an interesting woman. This was a man who had made a decision and was acting on it with the kind of clear, deliberate intention that Nathaniel himself had never once brought to his relationship with Victoria. She said yes, he asked. His voice was steady. He was grateful for that much. She has not yet given her answer, Eleanor said carefully. I believe she is thinking. What does she need to think about? Eleanor looked at him steadily. What do you imagine she needs to think about? He understood. She had been through one marriage that had not been what she deserved. She was not going to enter another one without being certain. She was going to take the time to look at this man, this apparently good, attentive, genuinely decent man, and determine with her own clear intelligence whether this was real, whether it would last, whether it was worth the risk of trusting someone again. He's a good man, Nathaniel said. He said it because it was true, and because saying it cost him something, and he thought the cost was appropriate. Eleanor looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Yes, she said. He is. She deserves a good man. She deserves to be the first priority, Eleanor said quietly. Not the person who manages everything while someone else gets to be the center. The first priority. From the beginning. She paused. Whitmore understands that. It appears to be simply how he is wired. The fire burned between them. I failed her, Nathaniel said. Not as a performance, not as self-pity, just as a statement of what was true. Yes, Eleanor said. She did not soften it. I don't know when it started. I've been trying to trace it back and I can't find a single origin point. It was gradual. That is how most failures work, his mother said. They don't arrive all at once. They accumulate in the small moments, the conversations you don't have, the questions you don't ask, the attention you don't give. She looked at him. Your father was the same way. I loved him, and he was the same way. This surprised him. You never said, there are things a wife learns not to say, Eleanor said simply. And then after a pause, I found my own satisfactions, my charitable work, my friendships, my investments in your education and your future. She looked at the fire. I made my peace. Not everyone can make their peace the way I did. Victoria chose differently, and I respect her for it. Nathaniel was quiet for a long time. Do you think she was right to leave? He asked. Eleanor considered this with the seriousness the question deserved. I think she was right to stop waiting for something that was not coming, she said finally. Whether leaving was the right answer, or whether there was another answer she could not see from inside it that I cannot say. What I know is that she made the only choice that allowed her to become who she is now. She looked at her son. And who she is now is extraordinary. I know, Nathaniel said. I know you know, Eleanor said. That is the part that is very sad. August brought the news he had been waiting for without admitting he was waiting for it. Victoria had accepted Whitmore's proposal. He heard it from Thomas, who had heard it from his wife, who had heard it from Georgiana Crane, who had been apparently one of the first people Victoria told. The news was traveling through their social world with the particular velocity of information that people were genuinely glad to share. Everyone, it seemed, was pleased. Victoria's family, her friends, the various people who had watched her navigate the past year with grace and intelligence and were glad to see her recognized properly. The response was by every account unanimous. It was right. She had found someone worthy of her. It was right. Nathaniel received the news, thanked Thomas for telling him, and then excused himself from the room on a pretext that Thomas was too kind to challenge. He stood alone in an anteroom of Thomas's London house and let the reality of it settle over him without trying to manage it. She was going to marry again. She was going to build a life with a man who listened to her, who sought her opinions, who had walked into her life and immediately understood what she was worth and had acted accordingly, had called on her and attended the same events and spoken to her family and proposed all with the directness and clarity of a man who knew what he wanted and was not confused about it. Whitmore had done in 8 months what Nathaniel had failed to do in 8 years. He stayed in the anteroom for exactly as long as he needed to. Then he straightened, went back into the room, and rejoined the conversation. No one commented on his absence. He was grateful for that. He wrote her a letter. He wrote it 4 times before he had a version he was willing to send, because the first 3 versions were things he wanted to say for himself. expressions of his own feeling requests for understanding the particular self-focused accounting of a man still trying to make the story about his own grief. He recognized them for what they were and discarded them. The fourth version was short. It said, "I have heard your news, and I want to offer my congratulations sincerely. You deserve every happiness, and I believe you are going to find it. I ask nothing in return for this, not acknowledgement, not forgiveness, nothing. I only wanted you to know that whatever I failed to give you, I never stopped believing you were remarkable. I understand now that believing it without showing it is worth nothing. I hope he shows you. Nathaniel." He sent it before he could revise it again. 3 days later, a note arrived at Ashworth Manor in handwriting he knew as well as his own. "Thank you." That was all it said. He kept it. September came, and with it an encounter he had not arranged and could not have anticipated. Howe was in London for a series of meetings, the kind that accumulated in autumn, like leaves dense and unavoidable. And on the third day, he found himself at a gathering hosted by a mutual acquaintance where he had not known Victoria would be present. She arrived with Georgiana Crane, and Nathaniel, who had been in conversation near the entrance when they came in, was close enough that avoiding the moment was impossible. Georgiana, who was a small woman of considerable energy and very direct eyes, looked at him with the specific assessment of a person who knows your entire history and has made her own judgments about it. Victoria said simply, "Nathaniel." "Victoria," he said. They were past the awkwardness of their earlier encounters, past the careful navigation, past the charged silences. What remained was something quieter and more final. The particular civility of two people who had shared a significant portion of their lives and had arrived through pain and time and hard-won honesty at something that was not friendship but was not hostility either. Something with more room in it than either of those. Georgiana excused herself with the efficiency of a woman who understood exactly what was happening and wanted no part of the social theater of pretending otherwise. "You received my letter," he said. "I did," Victoria said. "Thank you for sending it. I meant it. I know you did. That's why I responded." He looked at her, let himself look at her fully, the way he had not allowed himself since that December dinner. She looked different from the woman he had married. Not older, or not only that. She looked like someone who had been carried somewhere by a current she had not chosen, and had discovered on the far bank that the territory was better than the place she had started from. "Are you happy?" he asked. She considered him for a moment, and in the consideration, he could see her deciding whether to give him the polished social answer or the real one. She gave him the real one. "Yes," she said. Genuinely. For the first time in a long time. She paused. "He sees me. I know that sounds simple, but when it hasn't been your experience, simple is the most extraordinary thing in the world. He saw me. He sees me." The sentence did what it was always going to do. "I'm glad," he said. And then, because he had promised himself he would be honest when honesty was available to him. "I regret that I didn't. I want to be clear, not because I'm asking you for anything, and not because I think saying so changes what happened, but because you deserve to hear it said plainly by the person who should have said it years ago." Victoria looked at him. Her expression was not soft exactly, but open in the way of someone who has moved far enough past a wound that looking at it no longer costs them anything. "Why didn't you?" she asked. "I've wondered, not in an angry way anymore, just genuinely. What was happening in you that made it impossible to see me?" It was the most direct question she had ever asked him, and he understood that she was asking it now because now it was safe. Because she no longer needed the answer to repair anything. She was asking it the way you ask a question, when the answer belongs only to your own understanding. He thought about it honestly. He owed her that much. "I think," he said slowly, "that I had learned to experience love as management, as provision, as the correct execution of a role. And because you were managing everything so well, I read that as completeness. I thought the machine was running. I never asked what it cost the person running it." He paused. "And I think I was afraid." "Of what?" "Of needing someone," he said. "Of looking at you and actually seeing you, and then having to acknowledge how much you meant to me. Because if I acknowledged that, I'd have to acknowledge that I could lose you. And I found it easier to keep you at a distance where losing you seemed theoretical. Victoria was very still. And then you lost me, she said quietly. And then I lost you, he agreed. And discovered that the theoretical version of loss was nothing at all compared to the real one. She absorbed this. That's honest, she said finally. You asked for honest. I did. She looked at him directly. I want you to know something, not for your comfort, but because it's true, and because I think truth matters between us. She paused. I did love you. Not the idea of you, not the title, not the household. You. The man I occasionally saw when your guard came down. I loved him. She paused again. He just wasn't available very often. Nathaniel had no answer for that. The sentence was complete and entirely fair and contained both a gift and a grief in equal measure. I hope you let yourself be available, she said. To someone, eventually. I genuinely hope that. I'm trying to learn how, he said. She nodded once, and there was something in the nod that was not approval exactly, but was acknowledgement. The recognition between two people who have hurt each other and been hurt and have chosen separately and with difficulty to put down that weight. Good, she said. Then something came of this at least. He saw her one final time before her wedding. It was not arranged. It was not sought. It was the kind of coincidence that a city like London produces naturally when two people move through the same social world and the calendar happens to align them. He was leaving a meeting. She was arriving at the same building for a separate appointment. They met on the steps, and both of them stopped, and for a moment there was only the noise of the street around them and the particular quality of this specific pause. She was wearing the kind of expression a person wears when life is currently treating them well. Not performed happiness, but the quiet, steady satisfaction of someone who has arrived somewhere good and knows it. You look well, he said. I am well, she said, as directly as she always did now. He hesitated for only a moment. Victoria, I need to ask you something. You don't have to answer. She waited. When I said those words to you at dinner, your response, that calm, that complete, unshakable composure, he looked at her. Was it real? Or were you holding something together that I didn't see? She considered the question with the seriousness he had come to understand was simply the way she approached things that mattered. Both, she said at last. I was calm because I had been preparing in my own way for a long time, because some part of me had always known the ground beneath us was not as solid as I'd hoped. So when the ground shifted, I was ready. She paused. But underneath the calm, there was grief. Real grief. For the marriage I had wanted it to be. For the years I had given. For the version of you I had loved and waited for and eventually accepted would not be coming. She looked at him steadily. I just didn't give you the grief, because it was mine. You hadn't earned it. He absorbed this. But I am past the grief now, she said. Not unkindly, not as a wound delivered, simply as the truth of where she was. I am past all of it. I'm standing on different ground now, better ground. I know, he said. Then we can both go on, she said. She walked past him and up the steps and into the building, and Nathaniel stood on the street and watched the door close behind her, and then he straightened and put his hat on and began walking. Not back. Forward. For the first time in a very long time, in the only direction that still had anything in it worth moving toward. He walked forward. That was what he had told himself on the steps outside that building, watching the door close behind Victoria, for what he understood in some wordless but certain way was the last time they would speak, as people still tangled in each other's unfinished business. Forward. The only direction that still had anything in it worth moving toward. It turned out that forward was harder than it sounded, not because he was broken. He had not allowed himself the indulgence of being broken, and in truth, he did not think what he felt qualified as broken, so much as it qualified as reconfigured. He was a man whose understanding of himself had been fundamentally revised over the course of a single year, and revision at that scale did not happen cleanly. It happened in layers, each one arriving before the previous one had fully settled, until you found yourself standing in the middle of your own life, feeling like a man who had returned from a long journey to discover that the house he'd left was not quite the house he'd come back to. Ashworth Manor was the same. That was the strange part. Every room was as it had always been. The staff was largely unchanged. The estate's rhythms had been restored to something functional, even smooth, thanks to Gerald's careful work and Nathaniel's own belated willingness to pay attention. From the outside, everything looked the way it had always looked. But he had changed the way he moved through it. He began in the autumn following Victoria's engagement to do something he had never done in the years of their marriage. He started asking questions he didn't already know the answer to. He asked Mrs. Hadley how she thought the household could be improved, not as a performance of consideration, but because he actually wanted to know. He asked the estate manager about the challenges he faced that had previously gone unreported, because the estate manager had learned over years that the Duke did not particularly welcome complexity. He sat down with the tenants on the eastern edge of the property, men and women whose names he had known without ever learning their situations, and he listened to what they needed. None of these conversations produced dramatic revelations, but each one of them produced the same quiet, consistent experience, the experience of a person who had been unseen becoming visible. He recognized it with the specific recognition of a man who had recently watched someone he cared about go through the same transformation in the other direction. Thomas came to visit in October and found Nathaniel in a conversation with his head groundskeeper that was running significantly longer than any such conversation had run in the previous decade. Thomas waited. When Nathaniel finally came to meet him, Thomas looked at him with the expression of someone encountering confirmation of a theory. "You're different," Thomas said. "You said that in June. I'm saying it again because it's still true, and it's more true now than it was then." Thomas studied him. "What happened to you?" "I started paying attention," Nathaniel said. Thomas made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "That's either the simplest or the most complicated answer you could have given." "Both," Nathaniel said. Simultaneously. November brought the first real test of who he was becoming. A business situation had been developing for several months. A dispute with a neighboring landowner, Lord Casterton, over water rights that affected several of the estate's tenant farms. The legal position was clear, and Nathaniel had the stronger case. His solicitor had advised him that a direct legal challenge would resolve the matter in his favor within a reasonable time frame, at moderate cost, and with minimal risk. The tenant farmers affected by the dispute had been managing around it for 2 seasons. It had cost them measurably in yield and in the added labor of working around the restricted access. 6 months ago, a year ago, Nathaniel would have pursued the legal path. It was correct, it was efficient, it would resolve the matter, and he would have barely thought about it again. Instead, he went to speak with Casterton directly, not through solicitors, not through formal correspondence. He went himself without announcement, and he sat down with a man he had never particularly liked, and he said plainly, "This is hurting people who can't afford to be hurt. I would like to find a way to resolve it that doesn't take a year and a half and legal fees neither of us actually needs to spend." Casterton had stared at him. "That is not how you have conducted business in the past," Casterton said carefully. "No," Nathaniel agreed. "It isn't." They resolved it in 3 meetings. It took 6 weeks. Not perfect for either side, but workable for the tenant farmers in a time frame that actually mattered to them. When Nathaniel informed the affected tenants of the resolution, a man named Carter, a farmer he had known by name and nothing else for the entirety of his tenure at the estate, looked at him with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was close to it. "We didn't expect it this quickly, Your Grace," Carter said. "We've been managing it for 2 years. We thought we'd be managing it for 2 more. "I should have addressed it sooner," Nathaniel said. "I'm sorry that I didn't." Carter looked at him for a moment, with the measuring look of a man deciding if sincerity is genuine. Apparently, he decided it was. "Thank you," Carter said simply. Nathaniel drove back to the manor and sat with the particular satisfaction of that exchange for a long time. Not because he had done something extraordinary, but because he had done something that should have been ordinary and hadn't been, and the distance between those two things was still the measure of the man he was working to no longer be. Winter came to Ashworth with the particular quality of winters that feel deserved, cold and clear and honest. Nathaniel moved through it with the steady, unspectacular work of a man building something differently than he had built it the first time. Not rebuilding the same structure, building something else, something with different foundations. He heard about Victoria's wedding through his mother, as he had come to hear most things about Victoria through Eleanor's careful economical reports, delivered without drama and without the implicit invitation to respond emotionally that a less disciplined messenger might have included. It was in December, Eleanor said during one of their regular dinners. Small, family and close friends, by all accounts exactly what she wanted. Was she happy? He asked. Eleanor looked at him with the patience of a woman who had answered this question in various forms for over a year. She was radiant, she said. I heard it from 3 separate people who were present. Radiant is the word that kept appearing. Nathaniel nodded. And Whitmore, he asked. Could not stop looking at her, Eleanor said. Apparently from the moment she entered the room until well after the ceremony, as though he was concerned she might disappear if he looked away. She paused. I was told he cried. Nathaniel absorbed this. A man who cried at his wedding to Victoria because he could not believe his luck. A man who stood in a room full of people and looked at the woman he was marrying with the open, undefended fullness of someone who had never learned to protect himself from caring too much. Everything Nathaniel had never been. Good, he said quietly. And this time the word cost him nothing, because this time he meant it with his whole chest, and not just his manners. Eleanor reached across the table and put her hand on his briefly. She did not say anything. She did not need to. January brought a letter from his cousin Richard that contained, buried in the middle of 3 paragraphs about other matters, a single sentence that stopped Nathaniel cold. Victoria's shipping company had finalized its 2nd expansion. The returns had been extraordinary. Her initial investment had multiplied to a degree that several London financial commentators, who apparently had now begun tracking her portfolio with the interest typically reserved for male investors of significant standing, were describing as the result of unusually clear market analysis combined with exceptional timing. Nathaniel read the sentence 3 times. Unusually clear market analysis. Exceptional timing. He thought about the annotated business publications. The careful notes in the margins. The years of reading and tracking and developing an understanding that had never been invited into the spaces where his own decisions were made. I thought about every meeting he had attended, every decision he had made, every instinct he had trusted and wondered. For the first time, how many of those instincts had been quietly, invisibly shaped by the information she had been tracking and leaving on his desk for years. How much of what he had believed was his own sharp professional judgment had been in some portion the product of a woman whose judgment he had never acknowledged as such. He picked up his pen and wrote a letter to Gerald. I would like to begin keeping a proper record of the estate's management decisions going forward, not just outcomes, but reasoning consultation contributions from all parties involved. I want there to be an accurate account. He sent it before he thought too long about whether it was necessary, because it was necessary, and he had spent enough years doing only what was necessary after the necessity had become impossible to avoid. Spring arrived, and with it something Nathaniel had not planned for. Her name was Lady Catherine Fairfield. He met her at a dinner hosted by Lord and Lady Ashford in March. The autumn gathering that Victoria had always organized had evolved in the intervening years into a spring event at the Ashfords' own estate, and Nathaniel had attended because the relationship mattered and because he had made a commitment to showing up to the things that mattered. Catherine Fairfield was 34, a widow of 2 years, a woman with grown children from her first marriage, and the specific kind of intelligence that announces itself not in what a person says, but in what they listen for. She was seated across from him at dinner, and she asked him a question about land management that was so precisely targeted at the actual complexity of the subject. Not the social version of the question, the real one that he looked up from his plate with the surprise of someone who had not expected to be seen. You know about land management, he said. She gave him a look that was, he realized, the look a woman gives when a man has inadvertently revealed an assumption. My late husband's estate was largely managed by me for the last 4 years of his illness. she said evenly. So yes, I know about land management. He felt the recognition arrive in real time. The recognition of his own assumption, the exact shape of it, the way it had arrived before he even knew it was coming. I apologize, he said. That was a foolish thing to say. She looked at him recalibrating. She had clearly expected defensiveness. It was, she agreed. But the fact that you know it was tells me something. What does it tell you? That you've learned something you didn't used to know, she said. People who have always understood don't apologize for it. People who've recently learned do. He looked at her across the table for a moment. What was his estate? He asked, and then he listened, properly, with the full undivided attention of a man who had learned at significant cost exactly what it meant to actually hear another person. She talked for 20 minutes. He did not redirect. He did not offer his own experience as counterpoint. He asked questions that emerged from what she said, rather than from where he wanted the conversation to go. And at the end of the 20 minutes, Catherine Fairfield looked at him with the same recalibrating expression she had used after his apology, the expression of someone revising an expectation. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? What I usually get at dinners like this, she said. A man who asks what I know and then tells me what he knows and considers that an exchange. I used to be exactly that man, he said. What happened? He thought about how to answer this. Not the diplomatic version, not the version that protected his reputation, or simplified the story into something easier to receive. The true version. I was married for 8 years to a woman of extraordinary capability, he said. And I spent 8 years looking directly at her and not seeing any of it. And then she left, and the gap she left behind was so specific and so complete that I could no longer pretend the gap was about anything other than my own failure to pay attention. He paused. It was a significant education, expensive in every way that matters. Catherine was quiet for a moment. And the woman, she asked carefully, is happily remarried to a man who deserves her, he said, which is the best possible ending to that story. Catherine looked at him steadily. You mean that, she said. I mean it entirely, he said. She looked at him for another moment with the clear appraising gaze of a woman who had learned to trust her own reading of people. Then she picked up her wineglass. Tell me about the water rights dispute you resolved with Casterton, she said. I heard about it. The approach was unusual. He felt something in his chest that was unfamiliar in the best possible way. The feeling of being asked about something real by someone who actually wanted the real answer. He told her about it. All of it, including the 2 years he had let it sit before addressing it. She interrupted twice with questions that improved his own understanding of the situation. By the time the dinner moved to its next course, they had been talking for 40 minutes, and he had forgotten to perform anything at all. He told his mother about Catherine in April, during their regular dinner, delivered with the same deliberate understatement his mother always used when sharing information she considered significant. Eleanor listened. She asked 3 questions, practical, specific, the questions of a woman interested in character rather than credentials. Then she looked at her son with the expression he had learned to recognize as approval, operating at its most restrained register. She sounds like someone who knows her own mind, Eleanor said. Completely, Nathaniel agreed. And you're not frightened of that? It wasn't a question. He answered it anyway. No, he said. I find it clarifying. I find it genuinely clarifying when a person knows what they think and says what they think and expects the same in return. That's new, Eleanor said. Yes, he said. It is. She looked at him with the long, measured gaze of a woman who had watched her son for his entire life and was currently taking the full measure of who he had become. It lasted long enough that he felt it. I'm proud of you, she said. She said it without qualification, without the careful conditions she had always previously attached to praise, without the slight reservation that had characterized her assessment of him for most of his adult life. He received it the way a man receives something he didn't know he'd been waiting for. Thank you, he said. His voice was steady, just barely. 2 years after Victoria left Ashworth Manor, Nathaniel stood at the edge of his own land on a morning in late summer, and thought about the man who had sat at a dinner table and ended a marriage with 8 words. I thought about those 8 words often. Not with the crushing, immobilizing weight they had carried in the early months, but with the specific quality of attention he now tried to bring to things that had shaped him. He thought about the expression on Victoria's face when she accepted those words. The quiet that had followed. The way she had folded her napkin and set it beside her plate, and walked out of the room with her back straight and her composure intact. He understood now what that composure had cost her. I understood now what she had been carrying beneath the surface of all those years that had allowed her to face that moment with such complete readiness. The accumulated weight of being unseen. The quiet grief of a woman who had loved genuinely and given fully and been received as furniture. The years of preparation she had undertaken, not because she wanted to leave, but because she had understood with the clear intelligence that he had never bothered to recognize that the ground beneath their marriage was not solid and she could not afford to wait until it gave way. She had been ready because she had made herself ready. That was the truth he had taken the longest to fully absorb. Not because she had not loved him, but because she had loved herself more than she loved the idea of being chosen by someone who had never truly chosen her. He thought about Thomas, who had told him the truth early and often, and with genuine care. He thought about his mother, who had watched and waited and delivered her assessments with the precision of someone who knew exactly when each truth was ready to be heard. He thought about Richard, who had sat with him in the dark of his own confusion and not pretended the confusion was something other than what it was. He thought about Carter, the tenant farmer, who had looked at him with the measuring eyes of a man deciding if sincerity was genuine. He thought about Catherine Fairfield, who had asked him a question across a dinner table and then waited. Actually waited for the real answer. And he thought about the specific, uninvited education of loss, the way it stripped away every comfortable layer of self-deception and left you standing in the undefended truth of who you had been and forced you to decide in that exposure who you were going to be next. Gerald appeared at his side with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned his employer's habits well. Lady Fairfield's carriage has been seen at the East Road, Gerald said. Nathaniel turned from the field. Something settled in his expression, not the controlled composure he had once relied on as a wall, but the open, undefended steadiness of a man who had nothing left to hide from and had discovered that living without concealment was not vulnerability. It was freedom. "Thank you, Gerald," he said. He walked back toward the house. Catherine arrived with the directness she brought to everything. She came through the door and handed her things to Mrs. Hadley and looked at Nathaniel with the clear, particular attention she had given him from the beginning, the kind of attention that did not perform interest, but simply had it naturally because she was genuinely interested in the specific person in front of her rather than the role he occupied. "You look like you've been thinking," she said. "I have been," he said. "About what?" He considered giving her the manageable version. He had prepared a manageable version. It was ready, organized, edited to the appropriate length for casual conversation. He gave her the real one instead. "About what it costs," he said, "to spend years looking at someone and not seeing them. And about what you have to lose before you understand that seeing people actually seeing them is not a luxury. It's the whole thing. It's everything." Catherine looked at him steadily. "And now?" she asked, not pushing, not leading him anywhere, just asking. "Now I see," he said simply. "I'm not always fast. I'm not always good at it. But I see." She looked at him for a long moment with those clear, appraising eyes that had never once softened into vagueness when he expected it. Then she said, "Yes, you do." And that was everything. Victoria Whitmore, formerly. Victoria Harrington, formerly. Lady Blackwood, now entirely herself, by every available measure, stood in the study of her home in London, in the early morning of an autumn day, and looked at the life she had built around her. It was not a grand study. Nothing about her home was grand in the way Ashworth Manor had been grand. It was well proportioned and well chosen, and filled with the specific evidence of a person who lived in their space rather than merely occupying it. Books she was actually reading. Papers from the shipping company that was now one of the most profitable concerns in the northern routes. A letter from Georgiana that had made her laugh out loud when she'd opened it yesterday. A small painting that Adrian had given her on their first anniversary. Not an expensive one, but one he had found at a small gallery after she had mentioned once that a particular quality of light in certain paintings made her feel something she couldn't name. He had remembered. He had gone looking. He had found it and given it to her without ceremony, as though, of course, he had done this, as though paying attention to what the person you loved responded to was simply the most natural thing in the world. She still felt something every time she looked at it. Adrian came into the study and found her standing there, and because he was Adrian, he did not ask what she was doing or redirect her toward whatever the morning's schedule required. He came to stand beside her and followed her gaze to the painting and stood with her for a moment in the easy quiet of two people who had never needed to fill silence to prove they were connected. "Good morning," he said. "Good morning," she said. He looked at her with the particular expression she had come to know as the one he wore when he was simply glad she was there. Not performing gladness, not constructing it for any audience, just genuinely, quietly glad. It was the most ordinary thing in the world. It was the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced. "The Liverpool meeting is at 2, he said. "I know," she said. "I'm looking forward to it." He smiled, the real one, the one that reached everything. "I know you are," he said. "I love that you are." She looked at him. This man who had walked into a dinner at Georgiana's house and introduced himself and listened to her for 20 minutes about shipping routes with the focused attention of someone who found her genuinely fascinating. This man who had called on her twice and then proposed with the straightforward honesty of someone who knew what he wanted and considered clarity a form of respect. This man who cried at their wedding because he was happy, simply, fully, undefensively happy, and saw no reason to contain it. She had taken her time saying yes. She had needed to take her time. She had needed to sit with the risk of trusting again, to examine it from every angle, with the clear intelligence she had spent her first marriage developing in private, and was now free to apply to everything, to understand that what Whitmore was offering was not what she had been given before, and was not asking of her what she had previously been required to give. When she finally said yes, she had said it with her whole self. Nothing held back. Nothing in reserve. No contingency plans in a hidden drawer against the possibility of needing to survive. She had said yes the way she had never been able to say anything in her previous life, completely without protection, because the person receiving it had earned that. "I'll be ready by 1:30, she told him. He nodded. He touched her hand briefly as he passed, not a grand gesture, just contact, just the everyday, ordinary affirmation of a man who wanted her to know he was aware of her and went to begin his own morning. She turned back to her desk. The shipping company's papers were there. The letter from Georgiana. The morning's correspondence, which contained 3 letters from women who had read about her investment success in a financial publication and wanted advice, and 2 invitations to speak at gatherings. She would consider carefully before accepting, and a note from her solicitor confirming that the second phase of the northern expansion was proceeding exactly as projected. She had projected it. 2 years ago, with the same patient, careful analysis she had brought to every financial decision she had ever made. She had looked at the data and the market and the management, and she had known. She sat down. She picked up her pen. She had work to do. Real work that mattered, work that required everything she had and returned something equal in proportion. Work that bore her name and carried her judgment and moved in the world as evidence of what she was capable of when the world gave her room to be capable of it. The morning moved around her full and forward and entirely her own. Nathaniel Blackwood lived the rest of his life differently than he had lived its first half. How was not transformed into someone unrecognizable. He was still contained where he had always been contained. Still precise, still deliberate, still given to the careful management of himself that had been bred into him since boyhood. But underneath the containment, something had changed at the foundational level, something that changed the quality of what the containment held. He paid attention. Consistently, actively, as though it were a practice that required daily recommitment, because it was, and he knew it now, and he did not allow himself to forget it. He asked questions he didn't already know the answers to. He listened to the answers. He revised his understanding when the evidence required it. He married Catherine Fairfield on a Wednesday morning in the spring, in a small ceremony attended by people who mattered rather than people who were required. She walked toward him with the directness she brought to everything, and looked at him with eyes that had never once softened into something he had not earned, and he felt standing there receiving that clear and specific gaze that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Not because the grief was gone. Grief of the kind he had carried did not simply go, but it had done its work. It had stripped him and rebuilt him and left him standing in his own life with a clearer view of what mattered than he had ever possessed before. Thomas stood beside him as his witness and said nothing at all through the ceremony, which was its own kind of eloquence. His mother, sitting in the front row, held herself with the posture of a woman who is maintaining composure because the occasion calls for it, and who is underneath the composure entirely undone with relief. He saw her. He had learned to see people. That was the thing. The one thing that everything else had come from. Not a grand gesture. Not a dramatic reversal. Not a single moment of transformation that could be pointed to and named. Just the daily, deliberate, increasingly natural practice of looking at the people in front of him and deciding they were worth seeing. It had cost him everything to learn it. He had paid the full price without negotiation, and on the other side of the payment, he had found what Victoria had found, what Catherine had always known. What his mother had quietly waited decades for him to understand, that the people who truly see you are not performing a kindness. They are offering you the most fundamental thing one human being can offer another. The proof that you exist, that you matter, that your presence in the world makes a difference to someone who was paying attention. Victoria Harrington had known her own worth before she left that dining room. She had known it with the quiet, unshakable certainty of a woman who had spent years building herself in private because no one had offered to help her build in public. She had walked out of Ashworth Manor with her back straight and her composure intact. Not because she felt nothing, but because she had already decided that her feelings belonged to her. Not to the man who had dismissed her. Not to the marriage that had failed to see her. Not to the grief that would have been entirely justified. She had kept them. She had walked out carrying them, and she had taken them to London, and she had used them to build something extraordinary. And years later, in a morning that was entirely her own, surrounded by the evidence of everything she had become, she sat at her desk with her pen in her hand, and her work in front of her, and her husband's footsteps moving through the house, with the easy confidence of a man who had never needed her to be small, and she was simply completely, irrevocably herself. That was the answer that had haunted Nathaniel Blackwood for the rest of his life. Not the words she had spoken at the dinner table. Not the composure. Not the folded napkin, or the straight back, or the exit she had made without looking back at the house. The answer was who she had always been, who she had been sitting right beside him for 8 years, and the devastating, clarifying truth that the only thing standing between him and seeing her had been his own unwillingness to look. She had not become remarkable when she left. She had always been remarkable. He had simply, finally, irreversibly, and much too late seen it. And the woman who had once placed her hands flat on a dinner table and said, "I understand that is your decision, and I will respect it." That woman had never needed his seeing to make her real. She had been real all along.